Hi, good evening, everybody. It's time for Captain Zach's web chat. I thought in this time of lockdown, it would be a really good opportunity to find out a little bit more about some of the people you see in and around our club, particularly the coaches and committee members and so forth. So I'd like to start off our first web chat with our head coach, Mr. Paul Williamson. So thank you, Paul, for being a part of this evening and trialling this with me. I would like to ask you a few questions. So if you're willing and able, let's begin. Okay. Question number one, what brought you into triathlon?
Well, I saw an advert in it's actually in the Tiddenfoot gym, and there was an advert there for a new club that was being set up, a new triathlon club, and I just thought, well, I'll give that a go. And they were looking for volunteers to come along and help set up the club. So I responded to that, contacted British Triathlon, and it all went from there. I'd done a little bit of I'd just done some running beforehand, and I started to think about a few little multi-sport events. I'd done one sport beforehand, but I'd never done a full triathlon, and yeah, thought it would be a good thing to get involved in. Responded to the advert, and everything else is history.
Oh wow, I hadn't realised you'd been right from the beginning as well, Paul. There you go, I found something out
absolutely.
today.
Yeah.
Oh, superb. And volunteering from that time as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So I was the original treasurer for the club from day one, and help sort of set the club up.
Oh wow, well thank you very much, because here we are today on the back of your efforts and one or two other members as well. So thank you. So what's your first memories then of your triathlon journey?
Well, my first memory of the triathlon journey, I guess, was sort of following on from that initial sort of phone call I made to say I was interested in joining the club. Was that 4 people got together to start to create the club, with a little bit of support from Triathlon England. And so my first experience is actually turning up to a meeting of these other people, and those people were Diane, who's obviously still with the club, John Cow, or JC, who's again still with the club, although maybe not as much as he used to be, and a guy called Mark Canthos. And all of them had sort of appeared when I at this meeting to have huge amounts of triathlon experience, largely Ironman. Mark was telling us about how many hundreds of Ironman races he's done. So it was all a little bit intimidating, really, because I was there sort of having never done a triathlon at all, knew nothing about the sport, and volunteered to help set the club up against these other sort of people who appeared to have huge amounts of experience in triathlon and knowing exactly what they did. But it was all great fun. But that was my first sort of memory, I guess, of triathlon.
Wow, that's quite a baptism of fire, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm glad you stuck with it. What's your favourite training session? Training session that you do, not that you necessarily deliver, but one that you do yourself?
I think my favourite session is track run intervals. So it's one of those sessions which is always it's always pretty hard, and it's always one of those sessions that you always think about beforehand and dread having to do, particularly in the winter, and cold winter, and having to drive to a track to do it. But actually afterwards, and once you've done it, you feel absolutely great and really sort of pleased that you did the session. So yeah, I really enjoy doing that for that reason.
Yeah, I can agree with that as well, having taken part myself for many years, with your good self as well. And I think what's great about it is that you can run at what you need to do for your own pace, but still be part of the group that is there and attending. So yeah, they're great sessions. I'd agree with you there. So what's your most memorable and or your favourite race?
I think my most memorable race is actually it's actually a duathlon.
Yeah.
So it was the World Duathlon Championships in Aville in 2016, and um, it was the first sort of World Duathlon Championships that I'd been to and managed to qualify for, and I didn't really know how well I'd do. Obviously, put a lot of effort into it. It was also a draft legal race, and I think I'd only ever raced one draft legal race before, and that was probably the qualifier for that event. But it was a great race. I really enjoyed it, and I ended up coming 8th in my age category. So
Oh,
I
wow.
was really proud, and it was the first time I'd really managed to sort of get into that sort of top 10 position in such a competitive race. So I was really pleased with that.
And how did you find the drafting in the end?
It's a little bit hit and miss because you never really know where you're going to come out. Uh, and but on that particular race, I got into I was in a small group, which actually is probably the best thing to be in. You want to be in a relatively small group of sort of 5 to 10 where you can work together. You don't really want to be in a big pack, or not too big a pack anyway, and which often travel at a slower pace. So it's a little bit hit and miss, but it worked really well for me on that race, and that was probably the reason why I managed to sort of come where I did in the end.
Oh, that's brilliant. And that brings us on to another question, actually, is what's your best triathlon top tip?
So my best triathlon top tip, you might find this a little bit of a strange one, but when I first started going to races, you turn up at the race, and you obviously go and register, and you go and collect your number, and the numbers have never got holes in the top of them. So you then have the
Okay.
problem of putting the number onto your race belt. Okay. And the numbers also are designed to be quite robust because they're not intended to rip, or they're intended to sort of be able to sort of go through water and so on. So they're quite difficult to make holes in. So I now always put in my kit bag a hole punch so that I can make holes in that race number. And it's only a small thing, and arguably it's not really a piece of kit, but it actually it's what you don't want before a race is to have to be faffing around trying to make holes in a in a in a race number with a I don't know, a blunt key or something, because you haven't got anything sharp enough to make some holes. But that is a really important, a really key bit of kit that I now always put in my kit bag.
Oh, that's brilliant. So actually we've killed two birds with one stone there in terms of the kit and your triathlon top tips. So are there any other top tips that you'd share?
Top tip. So another top tip is always, I think, for when you get to a race, always make sure you know where the entrance and exits are of the transition area. I've done it before when you don't really quite get it really sort of fixed in your mind, and you've got to trying to work it out when you come into transition is never a good idea. You need to have that really ingrained in your head so that it almost becomes sort of a very straightforward process when you go through transition. So many people have seen sort of lose their bikes, or struggle to find their position in the transition area. So top tip is to make sure you know exactly what all the little paths you're going to take through the transition area are through each of the when you come in and out, and that will help enormously.
Oh, that's a great one. Thank you. What's the one thing then with all your top tips and all your races? What's the one thing that you have learnt not to do in a race?
So this is this is actually, I'd say don't do this anytime actually, but the one thing I particularly learned not to do is to fall off my bike in a race,
Oh,
which I have done once. Clearly it wasn't planned, but it didn't particularly seem to hurt at the time, but when you're going through a race, you go through it falling off your bike, and what would normally hurt quite a lot tends not to hurt because you've got the adrenaline going through your body and so on. And so I didn't really appreciate until I got to the end of the race that actually the extent to which I'd cut myself in that little episode. But yeah, it wasn't. I got over it. It wasn't terribly bad, but I did actually manage to take a bit of skin off my arm. So yeah, don't do that if you can avoid it.
Were you able to run after the
Yeah,
bike?
I did. It wasn't until I got to the end of the run that I realised.
Oh gosh. All this blood dripping now. So that brings us actually quite nicely on to what do you feel is your biggest challenge within the sport, and how have you overcome it? So I've kind of called this your triathlon nemesis. So what's the thing that you've either had to work on in the past and overcome, or you're working on now, or what's your nemesis, triathlon nemesis?
I wouldn't say it's a nemesis as such, but I think my challenge is the challenge I'd say is actually coaching in the sport. So I think with the racing itself and carrying out the sport. So I always think if you do something wrong in a race or make a mistake, well, it only affects yourself, doesn't it? It doesn't affect anyone else. And there's always another race, so you can always there's always an opportunity to put that right. Whereas with coaching, if you mess that up, you can have potential to impact others, and which I think is it's more of something you really don't want to be doing with coaching. So so I think coaching is definitely, for me anyway, at least more challenging than racing and doing any of the single disciplines. Clearly, I'd like to get better at swimming, but who doesn't? And but yeah, coaching is definitely a more of a challenge for me than the actual sort of carrying out the sport.
Well, you'd never have known that, Paul.
Thank you.
So who in the triathlon community then, and that could be anybody obviously that we know within our own triathlon community, or equally the wider community worldwide, nationally, or whatever. So who has been somebody that's influenced you or had an impact on you within our triathlon family?
I think quite a number of people, but I think the person who's probably had the biggest impact is one of the people I mentioned earlier, who was John Cow, JC. So he helped set the club up. He was the original chairman, head coach, all-round contributor to the club. And not only did I learn a lot from him about triathlon, but I think I just learned a lot from him generally about the way that he does things, the way that he coaches. And he's certainly helped me in sort of becoming a coach, as well as sort of just learning about triathlon. So he's been a great influence. Yes.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. And so that brings us on to our last question. What's your favourite thing about coaching, despite its challenges?
I think my favourite thing about coaching is actually learning about the sport and about how we can improve and what we can do to improve our performances in the sport of triathlon. There's a huge amount of science behind coaching, and while coaches, I'm certainly not a sports science in any way and don't have any qualifications in that area, but I do find it extremely interesting to learn about some of the theories behind coaching and what makes a difference and why it makes a difference. And I think understanding that and sort of putting that into the coaching context is interest. I find that very interesting, and I try to sort of reflect that in my my coaching as well. I always, when I first started coaching, there's it was always, always found it quite difficult to explain to people why I might be asking them or suggesting they do certain things to improve. And I think having that knowledge just to support it is really important. I really enjoy sort of investigating that and learning about that.
Oh, that's brilliant. And I certainly know from somebody that's been coached by your good self that I quite enjoy finding out why I'm doing what I'm doing. That does help, I think, when you're learning new skills and everything. So yeah, so it just remains for me to say thank you very much for your time this evening, and I look forward to hearing people and seeing people enjoy our little conversation. So thank you very much, Paul.
Thanks, Georgie.